So in a couple of previous videos, we talked about setting up file serving using Samba or NFS, and that's great if we want to have a permanent file server. But sometimes we don't. Sometimes we just want a temporary connection because we want to be able to copy files from one system to another. And there are a couple of ways we can do that. And we're going to walk through a couple of them here. So I'm going to start out. Let me show you what we've got here. So let's start out with this system. So I'm going to do an ls-l, and you'll see in my home folder here, I've created 4 files, and they're all really basic. Literally, I created one with one line of text and then copied it. So we have file 1, file 2, file 3, file 4. And this is going to be the system that has the files that we want to move over to our other system, which is here. And for this one, I created a file or a folder called copies. And if we look in copies folder, we're going to see there's nothing there. So I want to copy things from one system to another system, and I'm just going to put it in that /home/David/copies folder. Now, there are 2 different tools that we can use for this. One is rsync and the other is SCP. Now, rsync is built in, and rsync can frankly do some pretty amazing things. It's definitely we're not going to go through everything rsync can do. It's an amazing utility for copying and backing up, and lots of things we can use, or lots of different ways we'll use rsync. But we can, and I really suggest you spend some time looking at man rsync, play around with it a little bit. It's a great tool. But I want to show you how we can use it to copy files to a remote location. So I'm going to go into my, I'm not going to go into anything here. I already have it here. I'm in the folder where I have my files, and I want to copy those files to my remote system. So it's rsync, and you can't do this with CP, but rsync will do it just fine. And I'm going to specify the file that I want to move, file1.txt, and I want to move it to, so I'm going to specify the IP address, get my numlock right, 134.99 or 39.161.99 colon, and then my path /home/David/copies. And that will copy the file for me. And now if I come over here, ls-l for copies, there's my file. So it just copied it right across a network connection. Now, obviously, you've got to have permissions to do that, but if you do, copying across the network using rsync is really straightforward. Now, there is another tool we can use to do that too, which is SCP, and SCP is part of the OpenSSH client package. SCP stands for Secure Copy. And I can do pretty much the same thing. SCP, let's copy file2.txt to, and here I'm going to put David @ so my username @ and then the device I'm connecting to. .99, and I want it to go to /home/David/copies. Now, that'll copy the file over for me. If I put in the right IP address, that'll copy the file over, and it'll tell me that it copied it. Now, both of these, by the way, support a -v, which is a verbose option, which gives you a lot more information. So if you want to watch file by file, connection by connection, do the command -v. Now, let me come back over here and LSL copies, and there are my 2 files, one copied by rsync, one copied by SCP. Now, on both of these, I went to my source and I copied to my target. I can do it the other way around too. Now, the downside of this, by the way, is you need to know what you're connecting to, right? So you have to know the device you're connecting to, and then you have to know the folder that it wants to go to. And if you're from here, if you're trying to copy from, so let me go to my copies folder, and I want to copy from my remote location. Again, I've got to know the path to the file, but the other ones were a push. This is going to be a pull, rsync, and I want 139 .39.161, and my source is going to be .91, and I want the file home David file3.txt, and I want to copy it to this location. Let me try this again. 134.39. Okay, there we go. No such file or directory. So it did not find my file3.txt in my home David folder. Let me see what I've got over here. File3.txt in my home David. Well, let's try this using forward slashes instead of backslashes, shall we? And that will probably work much better. Now, I also want to do this. I'm going to do an rsync-v to give us a verbose readout of it. There we go. File3.txt now copied once you get slashes going in the right direction. So sent 43 bytes, received 109 bytes, transfer, total size, and right here is file3.txt. Let's do the same thing using SCP. SCP, and I'm going to copy from David at, oh, by the way, one other thing, and this hasn't popped up, but when you go to connect to a remote system using rsync, it tries to fingerprint the system. And so it asks you to approve that, yes, this is a system you want to connect to. And once you say yes, and it stores that fingerprint, and it doesn't ask you again. So the first time you try to rsync a file over to a new system or from a new system, and you see that, don't let it panic you. It didn't prompt me this time because I've used rsync on these systems before. So it didn't prompt me to copy those files over or to confirm the fingerprint. But once you've done that, then you never have to worry about it again. All right. So I'm copying from 134.39.161.91 : and I want from \home David, give me file4.txt. And I want to do this one as a verbose as well. And it threw something wrong here. Let me switch my slashes around again. And it's still not taking it. 134.39.161. Oh. Let me put the period there to identify my local folders where I want it to go. Good grief. I'm going to go back up. Before we look at this, I'm going to hit my up arrow again. The reason the command didn't work is because I set the source but not the destination. The destination of period says put it in this folder. And I just forgot to enter that. Okay, now this one was done verbose, and you see we've got a lot more input here. So SSH, messages received, authentication succeeded. By the way, because this takes part in the OpenSSH, when in the video where we talked about configuring OpenSSH servers and authentication using passphrases versus using certificates and all of that, all of those things are used by SCP when you do that secure copy. Okay, so now if I do my LSL, you'll see that I've got all of my files moved over, 2 using rsync and 2 using SCP. All right, so those are a couple of tools that we can use to quickly and easily transfer files from one system to another, as long as you know where the file is that you want and where you want it to go.